Andy Hilger. There we go. Good day, everyone. This is Andy Hilger. I'm hosting Caregiver Teleconnection today, and it's a pleasure to welcome one of our frequent speakers, Andy Crocker, who is with the Texas A&M Extension Service. He is the health coordinator. I don't know that that's his exact title, but our topic today is changing isolation and loneliness into better connections with others. Better connection and just better connections. Many of us heard, especially toward the end of the lockdown, about the numerous people that were experiencing a lot of loneliness and isolated because their caregiver maybe did not live with them, and they had to try to take the initiative to reach out, and very often caregivers are reluctant to do that anyway. Andy B Crocker has a master's degree in gerontology. He's extension specialist in gerontology health for Texas A&M Life Extension. His role is to support family and computer science county extensions agents throughout Texas as they do their outreach efforts to the elderly population in their counties. His research interests include the development of web services for older adults, as well as sex education and disease prevention in the older adult population. And please, Andy, even though our topic today is family education and family communication, please tell us what you're doing with web services for older adults. I know our listeners would, and Zoom participants would really like to know what's going on with that. Over to you, Andy. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Xanda, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Andy Crocker, and as Xanda said, I'm the Extension Program Specialist for Gerontology and Health with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Extension Service, we're a federally mandated mission of America's land-grant colleges and universities. And so you'll find the Extension Service in all 50 states and all the U.S. territories. And in fact, here in Texas, we're in 250 of the 254 counties in the state. If you don't know the extension faculty that serve your county, or know where the extension office is that serves your county, get to know them. And this isn't just for the people in Texas, this is for anyone nationwide. It's a national network that's part of your land grant. Get to know them. They can be a wealth of resources for you on a variety of topics. Most people only know us for agriculture and horticulture, and it is true, that's where our roots are. Get it, roots? But we have very robust programs in family and consumer sciences, family and community health, human sciences, if you will, 4-H youth development, community economic development. You might be surprised at what the Extension Service can do for you in your community. And so get to know those folks and what they can do for you. A little bit about me. I'm not a native Texan. I grew up in the great state of Louisiana. I did not attend Texas A&M University. I'm a very proud graduate of Baylor University in Waco, Texas, Sic 'em Bears. And I like a very relaxed session. So I would encourage you, it's probably best to keep your microphone muted during the session, just so everybody can kind of experience the session the same way in an uninterrupted fashion. But I do have my chat box open. And so I would love for you to talk to me via the chat during this session. If you have comments or questions, please put them there. I find that my sessions go better when we're talking about what you want to know rather than what I think you should know. And so utilize that chat box, please, and talk to me as we go through so that I can help understand more of where you're coming from and maybe what you're interested in about the topic.
And Andy, they are muted, and so no one needs to worry about trying to find that function. And when we're ready to have the discussion, we'll open that up.
Great, thank you. I also need to apologize to you. I'm coming off a bout with COVID myself. It took me 3 years to get COVID, and it finally happened last week. And so I'm still a little congested, and I may cough a little bit or clear my throat, and I apologize for that. I'm still dealing with some after effects, but we're not going to let it slow us down today. And so COVID is a great place to start with this, because while isolation and loneliness weren't new, COVID kind of brought them into view for a lot of people. And the responses to how we dealt with isolation and loneliness are actually quite fascinating. So in preparation for this session, I did a little bit of research looking at stresses and joys of older adults during the pandemic. And I think it's important that we talk about both stresses and joys, because if we only talk about stress, well, then we forget to find the silver lining in what we're going to. And if we only talk about joy, we forget that there's a worldwide pandemic happening or anything else going on that's causing us some stress. We forget to take the good with the bad. And so it's important that we look at both of them. But during the pandemic, there was a variety of studies, but this one looked at about 800 community dwelling older adults and asked them identify their stresses and joys that they were experiencing during the pandemic. And some of the main stresses that kept being identified over and over included confinement and the restrictions that were associated with the pandemic. Their concern for others was a source of stress. And then the last one that kind of rounded out that top three was isolation and loneliness as the kind of top three stresses that were identified by older adults in this survey during the COVID pandemic. When they talked about joys, the things that brought them the most joy during this time were family and friend relationships, digital social contacts, and their hobbies. Okay, so we're going to use some of that to frame our discussion on isolation and loneliness, and then we're going to come back to some of the negative and positive associations with some of those things. But I'd be interested, for those of you who want to share, if some of those resonate with you, the stresses and joys. Again, the stresses were confinement and restrictions, concern for others, and isolation and loneliness. And the joys were their family and friend relationships, their digital social contacts, and their hobby. Janice, I'm going to get a handout to Xanda after the fact. Again, it's my bad. I was down and out last week, and so I was unable to kind of prepare for this like I wanted to, but we'll get a handout to Xanda after the fact so that she can get it out to y'all. Okay, so let's talk about isolation and loneliness. So let me just ask you in the chat, if you'll respond to me, is there a difference between isolation and loneliness? Are they the same? Are they different? Kissing cousins, maybe? What do you think about that? Okay, so Myra says they're similar. Oh, good for you, Carla. Thanks for sharing. Carla says that connection to others did help, though connection may have been kind of minimal during the pandemic. And I would agree with that. So Myra says that they're similar, and we're going to go with Myra. They are kind of similar. Okay, so Carla says the same thing. They're similar, but they're different. And you're both correct, actually. Being alone and loneliness are related, but they are different. Okay. Isolation is the objective separation from other people. And I like what Sandra put in the chat where she says that they're not the same. Isolation may be a source of peace. And you're exactly right, Sandra. I'm at home alone right now. I'm isolated. Now you could argue that I'm not isolated because I'm on a thing with a couple of dozen other people, but I am objectively alone. right now, and I'm isolated. And Sandra is right. Sometimes we like to be isolated. Sometimes we're okay with that. This downtime, this time to reflect, this time to be introspective, to find peace and joy, or to recenter ourselves away from the madness of whatever we have going on with our day. Isolation can help us do that. Now, do we need isolation in order to do that? Probably not, but it can help because I can be quiet and still and alone with my thoughts in order to regroup and reclaim whatever I'm searching for or struggling to find. So isolation is that objective state of being alone, of being separated from others. Loneliness is different. Loneliness is a subjective feeling of not being connected with other people. Okay, so I'll say that again. Loneliness is a subjective feeling of not being connected with other people. And so I can be in a room full of people, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow in a room full of people and still feel lonely. And Ruth says basically the same thing. Being alone doesn't equal being lonely. And sometimes we're lonely even if we are with people. That's exactly right, Ruth, because we're not feeling meaningfully connected. Myra also adds that caregiving can be very isolating and not many folks want to be around someone, especially if you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's. It matters the reason why you're isolated. Yes, caregiving can cause us to be isolated. It can also cause us to be lonely, and cause us to be lonely in ways that we've never been lonely before. If our identity as a spouse or as a sibling or as a child or something has been threatened or upended, that can throw us into a loneliness that we've never experienced before, because we're not able to engage with that identity that we've cultivated our whole lives as a spouse or a sibling or a child or a best friend, or whatever your caregiving situation is. It can really cause that loneliness to come on in ways that we've never experienced it before. But just to go back to kind of the main points about thinking about isolation and loneliness, is they are similar and they can be interconnected, but at their root, they're very different. Isolation is being alone, and loneliness is not feeling meaningfully connected to another person or to a group of people. We all probably experience loneliness from time to time. And it can be acute or situational, or it can be chronic and developmental. Okay, so that acute loneliness may come on because of, a fight that we've had with someone, or something that's interrupted our relationship. And it can come on quickly and it can actually go away quickly, but it can also be something that's chronic. And so in the example we were using of caregiving, loneliness may persist for a long time because of the situation that we're in with providing care for another person. And so just be aware that loneliness isn't like a penalty box that you're sentenced to for the entirety of the rest of your existence. It can be something that we can work through. And we're actually going to talk about some of the ways that we can work through loneliness so that it doesn't fester and become a larger problem for us. And I just want to take a moment and thank you all for being so open and sharing in the chat, and I hope that keeps up. Again, I want to hear from you. My sessions go better when I do hear from you, and so please do keep up the conversation with me. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that are risk and protective factors related to loneliness and connectedness. So studies have shown that connectedness, feeling meaningfully connected to others, can help promote a longer life. It can help boost our mood, and it can help provide us a sense of purpose because we're a meaningful part of something that is greater than ourselves. We are feeling that connectedness to another group. Whereas loneliness may increase our risk for stress and anxiety. It can put us at risk for high blood pressure, obesity, depression, cognitive decline, and on and on and on and on and on. In fact, a lot of the research that's being done right now on brain health and cognition is really kind of getting away from the function of the brain and more about how the brain is affected by the types of emotional issues like stress and anxiety and depression. And in fact, a lot of studies are finding that, everyday forgetfulness, those things that kind of make us so mad and we call a senior moment or something like that, or people's fears about their memory function can actually be related to stress and anxiety and depression that they may be experiencing. And this has been borne out by people whose subjective memory complaints don't register on cognitive skills testing, and it really is about these emotional things that are going on in their lives. The other thing we know is that long-term loneliness can actually start to breed mistrust in other people. And so in that way, loneliness kind of becomes its own confounding factor, that our being lonely actually leads us to being more lonely, of making us want to or need to stay away from other people. And so loneliness can actually end up being this vicious cycle that it becomes harder and harder to get out of the longer we let it go on. And so we do want to take the risks for loneliness very seriously, and try to address those. And we want to try to promote those feelings of connectedness so that we can get some of those positive things that come along with connectedness, like that boost of mood or a sense of purpose. I want to talk to you about our need as human beings for social connection. Human animals are wired for connection. We are wired for being together. You've probably always heard or said or known or something the adage, there's safety in numbers, and there is safety in numbers if for no other reason than we kind of evolved as a species for group activities and connectedness with other people. So it is very important. Connectedness can help us counter the negative effects of stress and anxiety. And then again, that feeling of lack of connectedness can elicit feelings of mistrust or being threatened. And that can grow over time as we let that feeling of loneliness or not being connected fester a little bit. Physical isolation can still include social stimulation. So I spent the last week here in my home, and luckily I like being at home. I'm one of those people that I like being isolated. And if we were in a room full of people, I would probably find the one person that I know over in the corner, and I would go stand next to that person all night long, whether they wanted me there or not. And I might not say a word to that person other than an initial greeting, and I would be just fine there by myself. I feel the same way, in real life. If we were doing this session in person, wherever that might be, that we could get all of us in the same room from all over the country like this, I would be great at the front of the room. And that's tooting my own horn a little bit, but I would be great at the front of the room during the session and absolutely positively exhausted after the session. And I would go get in my car, or I would come back to my house, and I probably wouldn't say another word for the rest of the night, just because I need that time for me to kind of re-energize, and actually being alone energizes me. But that's me. And just like we hunger and we thirst at different levels, we crave that connectedness with other people at different levels. If I'm hungry, I eat, and if I'm thirsty, I drink. And if I sense that I'm not connected, or if I sense that my isolation is slipping into loneliness, I need to respond to that, because my body is telling me that I need this, just like I'd need a glass of water, or I need something to eat. And that's because social stimulation can be neural rewarding. I mean, our brains actually derive some kind of pleasure from that social connectedness. And so we need that, but we also need to help prioritize those meaningful long-term connections. And we're going to talk next about how to do that. What's the difference between some of the connections that we think may be helping us, when in fact they might actually be hurting us. So Xanda asked, what role do basic personality difference between the caregiver and care receiver play in isolation and loneliness? I've seen differences in the personality style create communication problems because we are not the same. And I think that's so true, Xanda. And that's one of the things that I think, especially in caregiving situation where maybe the care recipient can't be a full and active participant in his or her care. So I'm talking about cognitive decline, or some kind of communication issue where he or she can't communicate clearly, that the caregiver has to play both sides of the court. They have to play offense and defense. But I think that's also where the caregiver, kind of understanding him or herself really well, is a protective factor in that. So if we go back to the example I've used about myself, I am very self-aware of the fact that I'm quiet and reserved and an introvert, and I don't do public settings well, and all of these other things. And so because of that, I compensate for it when I have to be in that situation. Now, my ability to compensate for that wanes over time, right? Like, I'm really good for an hour. I may not be so good in the second hour. By the end of a full day thing, I am just absolutely toast. And I think the caregiver has to be aware of his or her own little quirks and personality, and then have the ability to compensate for those when they try to rear their ugly heads in certain situations. I say ugly heads, when they try to rear their heads in certain situations, so that it doesn't go off the rails. But I think that's super important. And it's to kind of go where you started, Xanda, where previously this conversation would have been oriented towards the care recipient, and in many ways it is, because they are a downstream, they are affected downstream by anything that affects the caregiver. But I think this is being very intentional in targeting the caregiver as the recipient of this message, to say, hey, this is okay. It's okay that you want to be by yourself. It's okay that you don't feel meaningfully connected to the person for whom you're caring, or your formerly very tight-knit support system or something like that. It's okay. What is not okay is when we don't do something about it. What's not okay is when we don't kind of take it upon ourselves to kind of create our own destiny as a caregiver in our relationship with ourselves, in our relationship with the person that for whom we're caring, with our relationship with our external support networks and care team, it is important for us to find a way to meaningfully exist with these groups for our own well-being, but then also for their own well-being as well. And so that brings us to, how do we keep and create and maintain and maybe even end some of those meaningful social connections? Well, during the pandemic, a lot of our meaningful social connection probably happened via, wait for it, social media, right? It has social right there in the name. It's perfect. How can it not be good for us? But actually, what research has shown is that time spent on social media can be associated with greater loneliness or perceived disconnection. I mean, how many of you have, scrolled through social media and decided that everyone's life is grand except for yours? Everybody's in an overwater bungalow in Tahiti, right? Except for you. Everybody has a brand new shiny vehicle except for you. That kind of effect can actually cause us to be more isolated. And let me ask you this: are you really connected to someone you wouldn't otherwise call or text or write or get on a video chat or meet down for a cup of coffee or something like that? So I may be one of the few dozen people on earth that isn't on Facebook, and that's okay. I mean, if I'm not friends with you in real life, I'm not sure that I want to be friends with you online, but I also don't have the emotional bandwidth for that, right? Like, I don't have the capacity to care that much about things, and don't take this the wrong way, but care that much about things that I don't really care about. And so that's one of the things that I've chosen not to have as part of my life. But I also think that that's a little bit healthy, and maybe that's just me convincing myself that I'm right in this situation. And I mean, it's my presentation, so of course I'm right. Y'all can all disagree with me after I sign off. But if you think about relationships 20 years ago, okay, relationships kind of had an ebb and flow to them. People came and went out of your life, and that was okay. And maybe you reconnected through a holiday card or a letter, or through seeing something in the paper or something like that. Or it's funny. So I grew up in very rural Louisiana. It's the kind of place that has a newspaper that comes out once a week. And I still take that newspaper because I want to see who died, who got married, and who got arrested. And my mom helps fill in the gaps a little bit, right? Like if it's between the weekly paper coming out, she'll let me know. And that used to be the way we maintained connection, is through that. But now the world would have us believe that I need to be invested with the friend that I sat next to in kindergarten who I haven't seen since then. Like, we happened to be in the same place at the same time for, this period in our lives. I'm now 44 years old, so 40 years ago. But do I? Am I really worried about what he or she is doing and where they live and how fabulous their life is? So, we need to strive for social connectedness that's meaningful, social connectedness from which we derive some kind of benefit or some kind of value. And again, I would question the social connectedness we have with anyone that we might not have, talked to individually, or handwritten a card or something like that. And so keep that in mind. I kind of chased a rabbit there, and so now I'm going to get back to where I need to be. But try to make your social media use affect your long-term social connectedness. Okay, try to don't quit what you're doing, but try to make those relationships exist on levels beyond scrolling through and clicking the little thumbs up or the heart or whatever it is to say that you like something. Try to engage with the person, with the content, so that your relationship is existing on a variety of levels. So what are some other ways that we can address loneliness? The first thing we can do is talk to our health provider about it. A lot of times we don't want to mention things like loneliness or sadness or stress or anxiety, depression to our health provider, but it's very important. I'm one of these people that when I'm ill, it makes me very angry. Like I'm not a needy sick person, right? Like I don't want care, I don't want nurture, I just want to be left alone to sort it out. But one of the first things that happened when I developed some of the symptoms, I tested myself, it came back positive. I called my health provider. Okay, didn't think twice about it. Had a fever, called the health provider. Cough, cold, call the health provider. Why do you think we feel differently when we feel lonely or stressed or anxious? Those symptoms are no less intense. They're no less meaningful or a sign that something is going on and we may need a little help. But for some reason, we're reluctant to share those kind of feelings with our health provider. We don't. We need to normalize sharing feelings of stress and loneliness and anxiousness and depression with our health provider so that he or she can help us. And I hear from people sometimes with, oh, well, I don't feel comfortable sharing that with my health provider. Okay, well, then what else don't you feel comfortable sharing with your health provider? Because if you don't feel comfortable sharing with your health provider, that could be a sign that maybe you don't trust him or her to help you or act in your best interest. And so think about that, think critically. And when you are having those feelings, be sure your health provider is on that among the first calls you make so that he or she can work with you to help address what you're going through. And because there may be no single cause of loneliness, a lot of times interventions are difficult. And if you think about your loneliness stemming from your caregiver situation, that's terribly complex to unpack. Because you can't really change the underlying cause of what you're going through. But what we can do is try to compensate with some other things. We can emphasize those sources of joy. We can find those positive associations in our lives that can help combat some of the feelings that we're experiencing so that it isn't all just bad. Remember, we started this out by talking about stresses and joys. And we're going to end talking about loneliness and positive associations for dealing with loneliness so that even though we may not be able to address that underlying cause of what we're feeling, we can try to strike an equilibrium. We can balance these things out so that it may not have as negative effects on us. One of the ways that we can do that to try to start to equalize a little bit is to recognize and try to resolve any underlying negative thoughts we're having. And these may be about us, or it may be about another person. So if we're questioning our self-worth, or if we're falling into stereotypes or dealing with negative self-talk or how we think we're perceived by others, all of these things can compound to make us feel less connected with people around us. But a lot of these things are in our control. If I'm questioning my self-worth, that's something I can control by noting all of the things that I'm good at and do for other people and all of the value that I bring to relationships, so that when I do get down, I've got this list that I can go back to say, here are all of the positive things that are associated with me and my caregiver role, or with me and my relationship role with this person. And so little things like that can help provide us the affirmations that we need to maybe get rid of that self-doubt or negative self-talk that's preventing us from engaging with other people in meaningful ways. Also, to combat our loneliness, we can keep our routines and our meaningful activities. And if you've been a caregiver maybe for longer than, I don't know, probably about 90 seconds, you've probably heard this message before, right? Keep your routines, engage in meaningful activities, things that bring you joy, from which you derive pleasure, that are completely maybe separate from your caregiving role. Just things that remind you of you. This is very important. That type of self-care is not a luxury, it's mandatory. And so, having those things in your back pocket can also help. Find ways to express yourself creatively. That can be really beneficial. So one of the things that I do as an outlet is I cross stitch. I love it. It's kind of mindless, the TV's on in the background or the radio's on in the background, and I'm, counting and all of these other things, and taking my frustration out on the little knots that form in the floss when I'm trying to pull it through the cloth. But the other thing that does for me is, well, a few things. So this is being recorded, and at the risk of my job, a lot of the things I cross stitch are vulgar. And so some of the things that I want to say out loud to other people, I do in this nice little cross stitch design and put some flowers and, a thing, and it's beautiful. And I'm able, it's cathartic in that way for me. But the other thing that it does is I like to find out things about people. Maybe it's what school they went to, or what their favorite flower is, or a saying, or something like that. And I'll stitch that up for them, hand it off to them. And it gives me the satisfaction of knowing that, I helped that person in some way. I was thinking about them, and I gave them this gift expecting nothing in return. And it cost me, 60 cents worth of embroidery floss and some hours of my time. But it benefited me because it was that creative outlet that I needed, and it benefited them because it was an unanticipated gift from someone just for no reason. And so find ways to express yourself creatively, to share joy with other people, and you're going to get that back from them as well. The other thing that I'll say to you is that physical activity, we can't ever discount the role that physical activity plays in our lives, in our well-being, physical, mental, and emotional, and may play in the life of the person for whom we're caring, if they're able to meaningfully engage in that. And so I would encourage you to try to, and I'm going to say try because excuse me, sometimes I am more physically active than others, but try to get that 30 minutes a day most days of the week, and try to engage the person for whom you're caring in that. It may benefit both of you health-wise, but then also, it maybe provides a meaningful connection between the two of you that's beyond your caregiver role and your care recipient role. It can be just a time where you're two people together, getting a little sweaty, getting your heart rate up a little bit. And don't discount the role that nature can play. Being in nature can be restorative for both you and for the person for whom you're caring. I mean, I had a great aunt that had dementia, and she, even when she didn't know, you know, relevant things like the day or who I was or who other people were, she could tell you that going for her walk and letting the wind blow through her hair was like blowing the cobwebs out of her brain. And I think that I always remember that, because there is something to, oxygen rich blood making its way to the brain and helping it cope with whatever else might be going on. But that daily walk around the neighborhood she would actually go walking with my grandmother, was something that she cherished, and it did restore her to be out in nature in that way. So don't discount the role that nature can play. So I'm going to go back to kind of the where we're going to kind of end where we started a little bit, and with some of the negative and positive associations related to isolation and loneliness in this study that I told you about at the beginning with the pandemic. So some of those negative associations with isolation and loneliness dealt with stress from concern for others, an unknown future, and contracting the virus, which we can all understand. But some of the positive associations that came from finding those meaningful connections to combat the other stuff they were going to came from their faith, came from exercise, self-care, and being in nature. And so, find ways to get those positive associations. Again, we may not be able to change the underlying cause of your feelings of loneliness, but what we can do is stack up this list of resources or these activities and things from which we derive joy or positivity or are protective for us against loneliness that we can go to when we need them. And is it always going to work? No, it's not always going to work. Just like other self-care and other tips and tricks and strategies and tools that you've used in your caregiving journey haven't always worked, but it'll work sometime. And when it doesn't work, we just go to the next one on our list. That's the whole point of having kind of a list or an inventory or multiple ways that we can give ourselves positive affirmations, derive joy, benefit ourselves, is because the one that we go to may not always work. And so we need to have another and another and another and another, so that we're able to find those positive associations to combat the negativity that may be going on otherwise. Let me get back to the chat here for a second. So it might be a good time to post all those self-care stress management lists we collect as caregivers to stay reminded. Absolutely. Online counseling when you get really down. Absolutely. Again, engage with that health professional. And I'm using health broadly we often only think about health in clinical terms, but there can be non-clinical health as well through a licensed professional counselor or a marriage and family therapist, or it may include your health provider. But you know what? Your health provider may also be a dietitian who's helping you craft meal plans for easy, healthy weeknight meals for you and the person for whom you're caring. So do engage the network around you and consult with those professionals to help you overcome. Humor is great, my favorite. All right, thanks for sharing that Carla and Janice says humor as well. And so in my retirement from the state in 10 years or so, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll start my own little Etsy store and do cross stitch classes. But if you're like me and you're kind of type A, in control and order and all of that, it's a great hobby because it's all about counting and patterns and repetition and all of these things. Xanda says humor. Sandra said homemade gifts are such a treasure. They are. I am struck by the simplicity, but also the meaningfulness when I get one. And I have seen that look on other people's faces when I give one. And again, I have a very good friend. It's in the background here. I'm pointing to it like you can see it. But I just finished. I have a very good friend that went to Texas Tech. And I did the little double T for him. And it's just simple black cloth with simple red thread. I've got $3 in materials, maybe, in that gift that's going to be very meaningful to him. And so don't discount that. Xanda says simple, fun puzzles, watching old TV shows, anything with dogs, cats, or yes, absolutely. Nostalgia can be very important, and especially like things that you don't have to think about. In a caregiver role, maybe we have to be on all day long, thinking about us and thinking about the other person. And sometimes maybe we don't want something we have to think about, So one of my favorite go-tos is the Golden Girls. I just kind of love to sit and laugh and watch. It's not anything that's gonna I would say it's not anything that I'm going to work into a presentation, but I just worked it into a presentation. So, find some of those outlets like that. Try to not be fishing in the ocean for a rainbow trout. Absolutely.
I like that.
Yeah, I do love that, Ruth. Find those things that are achievable, that make sense, that work for you. Sometimes you'll talk to caregivers and they'll say, oh, well, I've scheduled a pedicure for myself as self-care. Oh, that's great. When is it? Oh, well, it's in 6 months. It's the first time I can get away. Oh, well, maybe we need to look a little, closer in for something like that so that it works for us and it makes sense. Carla says, what recommendations do you have for connecting to others when they already cared for loved ones with dementia and don't want to get involved or have their own family and health concerns? Phone calls, I prefer face-to-face, but taking mom is sometimes hard if homes are not wheelchair accessible. Video calls. Carla, I think it's finding a way to convey what you need. And so, and I've done other sessions for this teleconnection, and we've talked about the importance of I messages versus you messages. And an I message helps convey what you need in your moment from your perspective, and a you message is often an accusation. And so, if you're calling me up and you're saying, you need to come by sometime, or you need to talk about X, or you need to share more about whatever, that's pretty innocuous, but it can also have the effect of the other person hearing blame or accusation in what you're saying. And so maybe one of the tips you could use is look at how you're phrasing your needs. So, if you were to call me up and say, hey, Andy, I would love to talk sometime about your experience with your grandparents. So both of my grandparents had dementia. They're both passed away. I was a long distance caregiver for both of them, but I'm generally open and sharing about that experience, to the extent that I can maintain composure if it starts to get a little too deep. But by telling me you should talk more about Granddaddy and Granny Pat, I'm likely to respond differently than I'm in a place where I would love to hear more about your relationship with your grandparents. And so I think things like that can go a long way to maybe easing. At that same time, though, if it's someone who has had the experience maybe that you're experiencing, they may think that they don't have a lot to offer you because they themselves questioned what they did and how they did it. You know, the thing about caregiving for dementia is the caregiver can do everything right, but the situation never gets any better. The disease doesn't end because you dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. And so sometimes talking to caregivers can really be challenging in that way because they think, well, what do I have to share? It didn't work out so well for me. And so, you know, with that in mind, maybe use that to guide your approach to talking to another person. The other thing I think is sharing exactly what you shared with me. Hey, Andy, mom would love to see you, or mom would love to visit you, but getting her out of the house is a challenge. Is there a time you can come over and I'll make some cookies and we'll, you know, just talk about old times, or get a photo album out and we'll talk about old times. You know, mom's not so great. And maybe this is another thing is level set where your mom is. You know, mom's not so great with what's happening right now, but if I pull out an old family album, she is right there with it. And we would have the best time talking to her about that. You know, one of the most meaningful interactions I had with my grandmother, especially later in life, is putting on at Christmas, like Bing Crosby and Andy Williams and Perry Como and Dean Martin and all of that, and just singing songs with her in kind of a non-threatening. I mean, if she didn't get the words, I didn't care. There were a lot of times I didn't get the words either, and we would laugh and sing and laugh and sing and connected in that way. And it was fantastic until it wasn't, right? Until she got tired of that, and then we moved on to something else. But you know, that was also something I could hand off to my sister when she would go visit. Hey, put on the Bing Crosby Christmas album. And yes, it was still a big Christmas album. That was actually one of the things that I wanted from her house after her death. And so I'll find a place in my home for this at a later time. So, all right. Janice says, I'm looking forward. When I saw the schedule for February, I recalled one of your classes in the past. We have talked about loss and grief in the past, and I'm glad to share some resources on that if you need them, Janice. Carla also loves the Golden Girls. Oh, Carla says it's more about feeling imposing. You know, I still think those iMessages, I need this. I want this. You know, this is important to me. Don't be afraid of using those very personal terms and that first person language, so that the other person gets the sense that this is you and what you need, and not what you think they should be doing for you. It's very subtle, right? Because in a way you are kind of saying, I need you to do this for me, but you're expressing it in terms of what you need and what you hope to get out of that relationship. I have loved my time with you today. It's been energizing for me. I'm going to sit here quietly the rest of the day and probably not speak to anyone. But I do thank you for your time and attention. I thank you for sharing with me in the chat. It always makes my sessions better. And I will look forward to being back with y'all another time for another session. But in the meantime, don't ever doubt the work you do for another person is meaningful, because it is. And without you at your best, that work you're doing for someone else isn't at its best either. So take care of yourself. With that, I will turn it over to Xanda to wrap us up.
Thank you, Andy. And I got real tickled when you said sometimes you feel like you're toast by the end of a session. If you did feel like toast, I can tell you this, folks, he was putting butter on it and a little bit of cinnamon sugar, because you really couldn't tell that he was used up all of his energy. He could pretty well maintain throughout the whole thing. I think a couple of summary, and I won't keep you, is talk about it, because some of the issues become a source of real conflict, and maybe talking about it, you can resolve it either with your siblings or even with the person you care for, depending on what their illness is. That whole business about different personality styles, not everybody's the same. And some people might consider being on their own for half a day as they're extremely lonely. Some people, like several of you in chat, said, having time to myself is really, it rejuvenates me. I like it. I like having that time just to myself. So have to figure out what our needs are and figure out what their needs are and try to find that balance in between, and maybe negotiate and find out what works for the best for you. One comment I want to make about the cross stitch, I had seen that. I remember being really surprised when I saw that in a hobby store. And as I understand, you probably are aware of this, Andy, it's not for everybody, but they actually have those stencil patterns, and they're the words in foreign languages. So that might be something.
Nice. I'll have to look for those.
Yeah. And so everybody, I hope this was meaningful to you. Hope you had some carryaways that you can take with you. But remember, we're not the same, but that ignoring when you see that person or yourself is getting lonely because of their isolation, it's time to do something about it. Andy said a while ago, you can't just talk yourself out of it. Do something, whatever it is, think back over your own history, what in the past, however small or large, can you do to bring back some of those happy thoughts and feelings, and know that everything is temporary, everything. So take care of yourselves. Thank you again at Minerva in San Antonio. Take care of everybody. And Andy, I can tell, because I know what you usually, bless your heart. Thank you for doing this for us, because I know I couldn't tell you weren't, until I had a camera, I couldn't tell you weren't at the top of your game. So you certainly are not toast to us.
Thanks,
Thank you again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.